my views might strike some people as radical, but I don't think of them as any more radical than the basic materialism. I think that I'm just drawing out natural consequences of materialism, and I think the people who say
I
they're
agree with that.
materialists and want to resist the consequences I draw need to look into their hearts and ask themselves whether they really are where they're really true materialists.
Welcome to Closer to Truth. I'm speaking with philosopher David Papineau about consciousness and other related matters. Of course, I knew of David for decades. Everyone in consciousness knows David, but I really didn't fully appreciate his profound ideas and ways of thinking until recently when I was writing my Landscape of Consciousness review article. Welcome, David. It's great to finally meet.
It's great to be here. Thanks for having me on.
A pleasure. You distinguish three critical questions related to consciousness, which sort of frames the whole area to how we should think about consciousness, and they sound very simple: how, where, and what. How does that work?
So, how do conscious states, conscious phenomena, relate to the rest of reality? Do they interact with them? Do they float above them? How do they relate? How do conscious phenomena fit in? How do they fit into reality? So that's the how. The what is what's the nature of conscious phenomena? Are conscious phenomena always representational? Are conscious states the same as the mind representing the world to us? Are conscious states, do they always involve self-awareness? If you're conscious, do you know you're conscious? Those are questions about the nature of consciousness, the what. And then the where is one of the hot questions. Which organisms are conscious? Humans are conscious, sure. Most people think plants aren't conscious. What about octopuses, bees? Where exactly is the line between the conscious animals, animals that have conscious states, and the ones that don't?
Good. That frames where we are. I just want to ask you a quick question, and then I got to give a more formal bio because to express your distinguished career. But here's the question: have you been surprised over the last, say, 20 years or so, or even horrified by the rise of panpsychism and idealism as solutions to the mind-body problem among pretty sophisticated philosophers?
Surprised, I'm not sure. I mean, philosophers can end up believing all kinds of strange things, and so that's kind of par for the course. Horrified is perhaps a bit strong, but I would say I'm not particularly enthusiastic about panpsychism. I think it's mismotivated. In my line of business, idealism is still very much a minority opinion. But panpsychism is all the rage among younger philosophers, and now you've asked me, I think it's a bit of a wrong turning.
Good. Well, we're gonna find out why very specifically in the next hour or so. But let me first give a brief bio. David Papineau, with degrees in mathematics and philosophy, is a longtime professor of philosophy of science at King's College London. He was president of the British Society for the Philosophy of Science, president of the Mind Association, and president of the Aristotelian Society. A realist and a naturalist, David's books include Thinking About Consciousness and the Metaphysics of Sensory Experience. David, we're going to focus on consciousness, but to prepare, let's begin with your foundational principles. So why don't I ask you each one, explain each very briefly to set the stage for consciousness. The first is realism.
Realism is just the view that there's a world out there that exists independently of human minds. It's not a construction of our mentality. It would be there even if there were no minds to observe it. That's one half of realism, and the other half of realism is the optimistic view that we can find out about it. That investigation, particular scientific investigation, will uncover a lot of the nature of reality. So that's realism. There's a world out there, and we know at least about some parts of it.
And this is contradicted by radical empiricism, which says we can only sort of know the sense data that comes into our mind, so we can know regularities, but it's impossible to know the nature of reality. So you disagree with that view?
Yes, and I don't really think that's a very serious view. I mean, it gets discussed a lot in philosophy of science undergraduate classes, but look, if you know the evidence for the atomic theory of matter, you can't seriously doubt that matter at low energies is composed of atoms. There's overwhelming evidence. I mean, all the data we have would make no sense if the atomic theory wasn't true. So it's just some kind of perverse exercise to try and make us demonstrate that theories like that are true. I mean, a lot of science is speculation, hasn't yet been established,
Sure.
but that doesn't mean that the sun is
Yeah.
powered by nuclear fusion. You know, the measles is caused by a virus. I mean, it's not serious to doubt these claims.
Now, the assumption is, for a radical realism point of view, that when evolution selected for fitness and survival of fitness and reproduction, it ipso facto automatically at the same time selected for a veridical, accurate assessment of the world. Did that just happen? Or because some people would challenge that nexus?
So that's a slightly complicated issue. We might discuss in a bit. I have a view that representation, the very nature of representation, is best understood thinking about it from an evolutionary point of view, the way that representations help animals to respond appropriate to their circumstances. And I think that once you have that kind of story, it falls out that humans and other animals do well to have true beliefs, and you get the good results when you have true beliefs. Whether evolution always selects just for truth, that's a slightly complicated question, because there's two dangers. One danger is ignorance, one danger is error. It might be that the danger of ignorance is greater. You don't mind too much about error. So whether evolution selects specifically for truth is a slightly complicated issue, but that we need to think about representation and truth in biological terms, I'm very strongly in favor of that.
Okay, well, we're going to get to that in our third foundational principle with teleosemantics, which you've developed. But before we do that, I want to deal with naturalism and physicalism as the sort of the second foundational principle. So define each briefly, and can you distinguish between them?
I regard naturalism as a rather loose and vague term. I don't really like to use it in precise philosophical arguments. It's standardly explained in philosophy, at least. Philosophical naturalism is the view that there aren't any entities in concrete reality beyond the entities uncovered by science. That's kind of ontological side of naturalism. And then there's a methodological side that philosophy will do well to use pretty much the same methods as science, use a posteriori reasoning, try and get theories that fit the evidence. But these are pretty general doctrines, and all kinds of different philosophers claim to be naturalists. Not many people want to be non-naturalists. So it's a loose term. And I think that on the ontological side, the notion of naturalism is given most meat when it comes out as physicalism stroke materialism. So the claim now isn't just that there's nothing in reality except what science will show us, because that's pretty open-ended. I mean, different people have different views about what science will show us. And some people think there's scientific evidence for ghosts. You say you're not a naturalist, they'll say, no, I'm a naturalist, all right. I just think the natural world includes ghosts. So you get a more substantial view if you say, no, it's not just whatever you think science uncovers. The natural world is exhausted by by physical entities. There's nothing over and above the material, physical side of reality. So that's now physicalism stroke materialism, which I'm happy to use interchangeably.
Yeah, I agree with materialism and physical interchangeably, but naturalism always for me had more of a epistemological, a methodological connotation
Ah,
to it,
okay,
whereas physicalism had more of an ontological and a fundamental reality description.
good. So I mean, I've written quite a bit about naturalism, and the distinction I just outlined, I think, is worth emphasizing. Uh, the ontological side, what's in reality is what science tells us. Well, that becomes more of a definite doctrine if you say science tells us everything is physical. And then there's the methodological side, which is that the scientific method is the only method of finding about reality, and that philosophy is just a kind of theoretical science. Philosophy starts with all the empirical evidence, the data of experiments and observations, and then tries to figure out what reality is like. I mean, sometimes it gets theoretically very messy, and that's why we have philosophers weighing in rather than just scientists. But it's not that there's some other technique for finding out about reality than the scientific way. And so methodological naturalism like that, naturalism as a thesis about how philosophy finds out about reality, contrasts with other views about what philosophy does. Some philosophers think that philosophy is a matter of analyzing concepts. It's a matter of trying to figure out what we mean by our terms. I mean, I think that's if that's what philosophy was, I'd give it up. I mean, that makes philosophy a very thin and empty business. Other philosophers think that there's some special a priori route of intuition, that we have minds that somehow have a way of getting insight into reality that isn't just via theorizing about observations. I mean, that's a more serious view, but uh, uh, as Kant originally asked, it faces the challenge: how is substantial a priori knowledge possible? How can you find out about the nature of reality without actually interacting with it? And so I don't think that philosophy as analyzing meanings or philosophy as based on a priori insight is a very good account of philosophy. I think it's just kind of abstract theoretical science.
Is it helpful to distinguish between different kinds, if you will, of physicalism, between necessary physicalism and what's called supervenient physicalism?
So I think all physicalisms have a kind of modal claim and necessitarian claim. I mean, I love Saul Kripke's metaphor. You must have heard it before, which is he's imagining God creating the universe,
Mm,
and so on the first day, God puts the heavens and the earth there, and then He puts the oceans and the the bodies, and God puts everything physical there. All the molecules and atoms are in place. And
mm,
now ask yourself: is God's work done? And and uh, many people would say no, no. He's left out. He's left out consciousness, or he's left out moral value, or he's left out. He's got to put some more stuff in. I mean, there's more to reality than just the physical stuff. But a materialist will say, no, God's work is done. Once He's put all the physical stuff in place, everything comes with it for free. Not even God could make a universe that had a being with my physical body, but didn't have feelings,
yeah.
because the feelings.
I'm familiar with Kripke, but and that's a wonderful analogy. But I'm familiar with him from your paper,
Right,
so
right, right, right,
that's
right.
how I learned about it. Let's go on quickly to the assumption behind your realism is that when evolution selected for fitness, it ipso facto automatically selected for a veridical, accurate assessment of the world. It just so happened to be that way. That's a fundamental assumption, correct?
I don't think so. I mean, I think that evolution gave us the power to represent, and we might talk about that some more, to represent the world. But it sure didn't give us the power always to represent it truly. Just look around. I mean, uh, false beliefs, fake news, it's all too easy. And humans have to work very hard in order to make sure that the beliefs they end up with are true. I mean, and I take it that's a large part of what science is. Science spends a lot of time and effort figuring out what forms of inference are going to lead us to the truth.
Yes, but
So,
the capacity to do that is is selected for in evolution. The capacity to do that, to discern
well,
between truth and falsity.
I think it's a bit more complicated. The capacity to form beliefs that are true or false, that's given to us by evolution. The capacity to figure out how to achieve ends, that's given to us by evolution, that we have to put them together and make our end the achievement of true belief and figure out what instrumental means will lead to us always getting true beliefs. And that's a very difficult achievement. And modern science, which is the classical form of that achievement, has only been around in a small section of the Earth civilization for 300 years. I mean, it's not trivial at all to be able to find out about reality. It's very hard.
Let's go to the third foundational principle, something that you have developed called teleosemantics.
Right. So teleosemantics is a way of thinking about representation. I mean, representation is very familiar, but it's philosophically very puzzling. I mean, just think about hear the sounds I'm making, and they mean something. I mean, I don't know. I say Elvis Presley once visited Paris, right? And that's a claim that's got a content. It's true if he did, and false if he didn't. And I use that example because I'm not sure if he ever did. And so there's a puzzle. How can sounds carry a message? And when we think about mental representation, we're thinking about states inside our head, maybe arrangements of neurons, and how can they represent the world to be a certain way? And teleosemantics is a way of answering that question. And it says that representation is basically a biological phenomenon. The way to understand representation is to start with simple biological systems that need to gear their behavior to their circumstances. And sometimes their circumstances aren't immediately apparent, or the time when the circumstances reveal themselves has passed. And so they have to hold a state in their brain that informs their behavior, that things with us and so in the environment. And that's the basic idea of teleosemantics. Our brain states represent those circumstances in which the actions those brain states prompt will turn out to be successful.
Okay, so now with those three aspects of foundational principles, realism, naturalism and physicalism, and teleosemantics, let's get into our core area of consciousness. Let's begin by a provocative statement that you make, which I would say many philosophers do not agree with. You say that there seems to be no immediate reason why consciousness should be singled out as posing some special puzzle about its relationship to the rest of the reality. Most philosophers who might be materialists and physicalists, and most are, would say there's a big puzzle, but we can figure it out. You say there's not even a puzzle.
Well, I think if you're a dualist, you'll think there's a puzzle. But if you're a materialist about consciousness, why should consciousness be any more puzzling than clouds or rain or I don't know, acidity? I mean, it's just one among the many physical processes in the world. So, but that, of course, presupposes that we're materialists about consciousness, and that's where all the puzzles come in. But once you accept materialism about consciousness, then there's no further puzzle about how it fits in. It fits in just like everything else. It's part of the physical world, and as part of the physical world, it interacts with other parts of the physical world.
Absolutely. What you say makes absolute sense. But the question is, which comes first, chicken or egg, in terms of understanding it? Because it seems slightly circular in that kind of analysis. Because if you are assuming consciousness is physical, and then you say physicalism supports the idea that there's no puzzle about consciousness. The excretion of consciousness from the brain is like the excretion of urine from the kidney. I mean, if you assume one, then that would be the case. But how do you get into this vicious cycle?
So I think it's helpful to kind of look at the argumentative geography here from the beginning. So I take there to be a pretty compelling argument that conscious states must be one and the same as physical states. I take there to be a compelling argument for flat-footed materialism. And then, as I just said, once you accept the materialism, what's the remaining problem? Where's the puzzle? It's just another part of the material world. Now, we can discuss this argument for materialism about consciousness, and see how compelling. Not you mightn't find it that compelling, but there it is. I mean, it's basically that if consciousness wasn't part of the physical world, it wouldn't be able to produce the effects in the physical world that it clearly does. So there's the argument for materialism. Now, we haven't mentioned yet, but off to the side, there's all kinds of well-known philosophical arguments, the Mary argument, the zombie argument, and so on, that argue that consciousness can't possibly be material. Consciousness must be something separate from the material realm. And now, of course, we have a philosophical standoff. We have the arguments for materialism and the arguments against materialism, and one side's going to have to give. And that's where the issue is. But from my point of view, there's no hard problem that needs to be solved. The only problem is we've got to convince ourselves to be materialists, and then the hard problem dissolves away.
Right. You have a wonderful quote that says that you never viewed the so-called hard problem as any problem at all. That's a direct quote.
Yeah.
Because a robust physicalism can dissolve the problem of consciousness. Now, this is the so-called explanatory gap between mind states and brain states, which very simply argues that it's just prima facie obvious that they're not the same thing. The idea of a mind state of me looking at you now is the same thing as a train of neurons at a certain frequency with a certain electromagnetic field, or whatever your particular theory of neurobiological consciousness happens to be. But that's what it is, and many people would find that astonishing.
So look, I've never denied that dualism, the view that the conscious realm is separate from, extra to the physical realm, that God still needs to do more work on the seventh day to put the consciousness in. I've never denied that view is intuitively plausible. I think it's got a strong, compelling grip on our intuition. I think it's very hard not to think as a dualist. But I think that intuition is just a mistake. I mean, I said earlier that in philosophy, there's some people who think you can get insight in reality by some special mode of a priori philosophical intuition. I say no. Intuitions are just thoughts that come to us, might be very bad theories. We need to assess them against the evidence and argument. And when we assess this one against the evidence and argument, it turns out, as I said, there's an overwhelming argument in favor of materialism and to show us that dualism is a mistake. But I agree that the so-called explanatory gap, the so-called hard problem, they aren't yet arguments. They're just expressions of dualism. I mean, of course, if you're a dualist, then you'll be puzzled about why, when I get certain neural oscillations in V4, I have an experience of seeing something red because you think the experience of seeing something red is something extra to the neural oscillations. And now you're really puzzled. I mean, explain why this extra thing arises. But I don't think it arises at all. I think it just is the neural oscillations. And so I don't have any big puzzle to explain. There's nothing left to explain. I've identified the conscious experience of red with the neural oscillations.
So the question is the arrow of explanatory causation, because we have, to put it simply, we have a materialist physicalist view, we have a dualist view, and then we have the nature of consciousness. And your view is that we start with that tension, at least initial tension, between the materialist and the dualist point of view. And once you get materialism as your view, then you're forced to see consciousness. But other people see consciousness as recursively affecting your analysis between materialism and dualism. And so it's not clear that you can start in one place. It seems like with two unknowns, you need two equations. You can't start with one. Both of them have to be figured at the same time. That's what gives me problems.
Let me try and lay it out like this. All right, we've got two positions: the materialist position, the dualist position. Now, I say, and I'll say a little bit more about it in a second. There's a strong argument for the materialist position. Okay, what's to be said on the dualist side? All that's to be said on the dualist side is it seems to us intuitively that consciousness is separate from the physical world. But that's not yet an argument. That's just an expression of an opinion. Now, maybe the materialist ought to spend some time trying to explain why this mistaken impression arises, but we can do that. But still, I say an impression is not yet an argument. And on the materialist side, we do have a pretty strong I won't beg the question by saying knockdown argument, but it's pretty close to it. And it's the standard argument that, look, I mean, my conscious feelings, my pain, they make me move my arm, right? But ask the scientists, why did my arm move? Well, it's because the muscles contracted, the nerve messages, certain activity in the motor cortex. The scientist doesn't think there's anything going on there apart from a whole bunch of physical processes. So how did my feeling, the feeling of pain, get to make my arm move when my arm was already fully caused to move by the neural processes in the brain? And if you think of the conscious feeling as something extra to the brain, then it ends up ridiculously dangling like an epiphenomenal puff of smoke, or the train's whistle that is shot off by the brain but doesn't make any difference to what I do. So the argument for materialism is, look, conscious feelings have effects in the physical world. They couldn't do that unless they were themselves physical. And that's a pretty compelling argument.
Yeah, that assumes the closure of the physical.
Quite. Right. So I slipped in there as something that every educated person will agree about, a very substantial assumption, which, if you think about it, historical dualists would have denied. The assumption was that the conscious stuff never comes down and makes a difference in the physical world. The assumption was the physical world is sufficient unto itself. The physical world is causally closed. Nothing in the physical world is caused by anything except other physical processes. And one might well want to deny that. But to my mind, that flies in the face of 100 plus years of modern science, modern neurophysiology. And it's very striking that scarcely any of the philosophers in the mind-brain debate are prepared to reject that assumption. All the dualists who end up being panpsychists, or they become epiphenomenalists and so on, they're driven to these strange views because they don't want to deny the causal closure of the physical. If they deny the causal closure of the physical, they could be happy Cartesian dualists. There's a separate mind that interacts with the body, and so on. You don't find among the philosophical uh,
Good point.
participants Cartesian dualists, and that's because the causal closure of the physical is a very difficult thing to deny nowadays. Okay, so let me put you right. I've now got a good knockdown argument from the materialist point of view, and on the dualist side, all you've got is an intuition.
David, I love your identity theory, your argument for neurobiological physicalism with an unabashed, robust, fundamental brain mind identity. I've looked at, in my Landscape of Consciousness paper, literally a couple of hundred different kinds of theories of consciousness. And all of them, in my opinion, at the very end, really is a kind of identity theory. They have to say that something, to be a complete and sufficient explanation of consciousness, must be consciousness, make an identity claim. What I love about your approach is you're unabashed. You come out and say that right at the beginning. And it forces us to really understand not just the nature of your argument, but I think the nature of every argument in trying to explain consciousness from a materialistic point of view.
Good. Well, I'm very glad to hear it, and I'm very impressed by your landscape article. I can't say I've memorized all of it because there's such a lot of coverage in it. I mean, you look at how many was it? 100 different views, or
I think if you add it all up, it's over 200.
200 different views. Yes, yes. Good. Well, I think for the reasons I was just outlining, that you get into terrible trouble unless you identify conscious processes with material processes in the brain. But I'm not sure that all the different theorists, particularly scientific theorists, who are developing theories of consciousness are always as clear-headed about this as they might be.
I agree.
And I think a lot of the time, nearly all of them, I should think, if you pressed them, you'd say, "Are you a materialist or a dualist?" They say, "No, I'm a materialist."
Sure.
Then when you look at how they phrase the problem, you'll see dualist kinds of ways of setting things up slipping in. They'll talk about how does the brain generate consciousness? How does the brain give rise to consciousness? Where does the brain yield consciousness? Which is the idea that the consciousness is something extra to the oscillations of the neurons, that sometimes some magic thing happens and then you get this extra light, this extra aura, this extra field. And I think that kind of dualist thinking is behind, kind of motivates, maybe distorts a lot of research into consciousness. But to the extent the theorists end up endorsing some identity theory, well, I'm all in favor of that, certainly.
Yeah, but it's fundamental to what they're doing. Your distinction between the brain generating consciousness, because if you generate something, then it has to be. It sounds like it's something else. So
Absolutely.
how then the brain generate? And you're saying that once you use the term yield, generate, produce, you've already fallen into a dualistic trap, and your system won't work.
Exactly.
All right, let's really dig down on what identity really means. So I would have the analogy that Venus is the morning star and the evening star. You see it in both
Right.
places classically described. And so you couldn't eliminate the morning star without eliminating the evening star. You have some even better examples than I've used with Cary Grant and Marilyn Monroe. So tell me about those.
Hang on. So, Cary Grant is Archie Leach, and Marilyn Monroe is Norma Jean Baker. Let's not muddle them up. But I mean, what those examples illustrate is here we have two different concepts that, in truth, refer to the same thing, but you could well have both those concepts and not realize they refer to the same thing. You might have grown up with Norma Jean Baker and seen Marilyn Monroe in the movies and not put the two together. And so I think that's a good model for what's going on in consciousness. I mean, I want to say that the conscious states are one and the same as the brain states, but of course we have two different ways of thinking about them, two radically different ways of thinking about them. We can think about, say, the experience of seeing something red as in terms of what it feels like, and now you imagine the experience from the inside, as it were. And you can think, as a neuroscientist might think, about certain oscillations in V4, a certain area of the neural cortex. And it's not obvious, to say the least, that they're the same thing. I mean, that's what the materialists want to say. They say, we materialists say, we've got very good evidence that these two concepts refer to the same thing. But they are very different ways of thinking about that thing. And the fact that they're very different, I think, can be a source of much confusion. I mean, I mentioned earlier the strong intuition that dualism is true, that the conscious states are something extra to the physical states. And I think that, I mean, this is something you might talk about, exactly what's the explanation for that intuition from the dualist point of view. But it's going to be something to do with the fact we have these two very different ways of thinking about what I as a materialist say is the same state.
So this is a good place to talk about philosophical zombies, which is one of the arguments against a radical materialism, which says, I can imagine, word is tricky, conceive, imagine, possible, an exact world as it is today, an exact arrangement of atoms and molecules and quantum fields or whatever, that does exactly the same behaviorally, but has no inner light, no inner awareness, inner experience. And the philosophical zombies are as stable in the literature, and everybody has fun and argues. You make the interesting point that if you begin that discussion, you've already fallen into an anti-physicalist trap, that even if you engage in the discussion, the physicalist has already lost. So explain that.
Well, one has to be careful with the terms here. You started off by saying you can imagine a being that's physically just like me, but has no feelings. And I agree about that. Of course, we can imagine such a thing because we have two concepts of the feelings. So we can apply one concept. Here's a being with certain neural oscillations in V4, and we can withhold the other concept. But he doesn't have this feeling, and now we imagine the feeling. So we can imagine a zombie, but think I can imagine. I mean, I might not just imagine, I might actually believe that Marilyn Monroe is not Norma Jean Baker, because I've got two concepts, and I can say, here's Marilyn Monroe, but now I use the other concept, not Norma Jean Baker. But of course, in that case, it's perfectly obvious that the fact you can imagine the two things coming apart doesn't mean it's possible for them to come apart. Look, the ancients mightn't have known that the evening star was the morning star. They could imagine, the evening star being destroyed and the morning star still being there. But of course, what they were imagining wasn't possible. And so that's what I'll say about the zombie case. It's imaginable that you have a being with my brain but not my feelings. But what we're imagining is no more possible than Marilyn Monroe without Norma Jean Baker.
Yeah, it's a very simple argument, and it is very consistent with everything you say about identity theory, and it's an important point to realize. Let's go into briefly a description of physicalism a posteriori versus a priori, and how that distinction of what we can know, which you've alluded to a little earlier, but directly affects our understanding of consciousness.
So a priori physicalism, I mean, that's a complicated term for what really is behaviorism, logical behaviorism. That was the view that pretty much went out 30 or 40 years ago as a result of Frank Jackson's Mary thought experiment. That was the view. Our only concepts of mental states were concepts of states that made you behave a certain way. So think, behaviorist account, somebody's in pain. To say they're in pain is to say they've got some state inside them that's caused by damage and gives rise to avoidance behavior. And if you think that that's your only concept of pain, then of course you've got no room to imagine somebody who's been damaged and the state's causing avoidance behavior not being in pain. By definition, such a being is in pain. So that's a priori physicalism. The conscious facts are by definition guaranteed by the physical facts, because our only concept of conscious mental states is states that play a certain physical role. And I take Frank Jackson's Mary thought experiment to refute that. If you're familiar with it, I mean,
sure. Why don't you describe it very quickly?
Just to remind ourselves, Mary, she's a future neuroscientist, specializes in color vision. She knows everything there is to know from a physical point of view about color experiences, oscillations in V4, wavelengths, reflectance profiles, and so on. But she's never had any color experiences herself. She's just lived all her life.
She lives in a black and white bubble.
Yeah, and somebody comes in and paints her skin every morning to make it white or grey. She doesn't see any pink, no colors. And then one day she's let out and she sees colors. And Frank Jackson said, surely Mary now knows something she didn't know before, namely that when you look at a ripe tomato, because she could always talk about ripe tomatoes, she was a scientist, it feels like this. And now she has what we call in the trade a phenomenal concept of the experience. She can think about it in terms of what it's like because she's had it when she couldn't before. And now we could discuss whether this suffices to show dualism is true, which is what Jackson originally suggested. But I think
originally, but not later.
Yeah, no, Frank's trajectory on these matters is complicated. But the materialists pretty quickly came back and said, and all that's happened it's like the morning star and the evening star. All that's happened is Mary now has another concept to refer to what she could always refer to as oscillations in the visual cortex. And so it doesn't prove there's anything extra in reality. It just proves that there's a certain way of thinking about conscious mental states that is not thinking in scientific physical terms. You think of them in terms of what they're like.
Yeah. And that's why your identity theory is so internally consistent.
Right.
That it deals with this very, very quickly and very naturally, as opposed to all of the other, shall we say, neurobiological theories, computational theories, electromagnetic field theories, informational theories that seek to do another level of explanation because they can't, as you would put it, get out of this kind of stealthy dualist perspective.
Well, I don't know if that's fair to those theories. Look, something's been going on in our examples that is kind of helpful to me, but in fact leads me to address the issue that all the standard integrated information theory, global workspace theories are trying to address. I've been focusing on what's the brain state that constitutes red experiences. And there we have, we've got a pretty good idea which brain states constitute red experiences. Is a certain, well, in fact, color experience is quite complicated, but a certain area of the visual cortex, sometimes called V4, that looks like where the color experiences go on. But you haven't asked me the more generic question. Come on, David. Uh, which kind of brain processes constitute consciousness of any kind? We talked about the where question right at the beginning, and you might say to me, oh, come on, David, you think that red experiences are identical with certain oscillations in V4, but tell me what you think conscious experience as such is identical with. And I haven't said anything about that, and I don't have any very well worked out theories about that. And but that's a place where you might find me saying, "Oh, it's anything that is in a global workspace, anything that any states that are generally available for controlling behavior and deliberation, something like that. Once you've got a state like that, it's going to be conscious." And that would be a matter of identifying the generic property consciousness with some specific kind of brain process.
Sure, because we know in the brain, the cerebellum, for example, is not conscious, and many of the parts of the brain are not conscious, and so, but that's a different kind of question than the fundamental question of what it is. I mean, where it occurs in the brain, under what circumstances, that's a scientific question. But however
Yeah.
you do that, it is not going to falsify what you're saying about identity theory in any way.
No, that would be. I mean, yeah, that would be a species of identity theory. Absolutely, absolutely.
Right. So, given your radical identity
Yeah.
theory, which, as I said, I love, doesn't mean I believe, but I do love it, you are still skeptical of the conventional materialist claim that ultimately neuroscience will uncover the complete neurobiological basis of consciousness. Why the skepticism?
Well, despite everything I've been saying so far today, rather skeptical about the whole consciousness business. I think a lot of philosophical thinking and a lot of scientific investigation into consciousness is mismotivated by dualist presuppositions. So I think the whole business of trying to come up with a theory of consciousness as such, we were talking about that just a moment ago, is a bad idea. I'm not sure that there is a definite thing, consciousness, that is there for science to discover. I mean, here's an analogy. I mean, I'll give you a couple of analogies. I mean, one analogy is life. I mean, do we have a theory of life? Do we have a good scientific account of what gives rise to life? I mean, there was a time when people used to think like that because they thought there was a vital spirit, some extra feature of reality present in living organisms. But now we don't think that anymore. Nobody goes around trying to develop a theory of life. I mean, a bit we try and define are viruses alive, but nobody has a definite view about whether the virus is alive, and we don't care. In fact, I have a better analogy. I mean, I think that life, there is a pretty sharp line between things that are alive and things that are not. But imagine trying to develop a scientific theory of intelligence. Okay, I mean, okay, so I'm a scientist. I'm really interested. I want to find out what gives rise to intelligence, and you start looking around for which bits of the brain, which brain processes give rise to intelligence, and then you'll be able to figure out whether other animals have intelligence because do they have those brain processes. And if you think about that project, the natural thing is to say, no, that's silly. I mean, intelligence comes in degrees. It's not a thing. It's not a thing. I mean, any animal that moves around needs a brain that will help it figure out what to do, and then you get all kinds of degrees of intelligence. And I feel rather the same about consciousness. It's not a thing. The idea that it's a thing is largely driven by this implicit dualist intuition that there's a definite light that comes on when consciousness is present. But if you really give up on that idea, the whole notion of consciousness becomes a lot less definite. I mean, it's like life, or even even more indefinite, something like intelligence. And I rather think,
So you
yeah,
use the nice term vague, that
yeah,
consciousness is a vague concept, so that the attempt to
yeah.
isolate it, even neurobiologically, is a vain project,
Yeah.
because ab initio, from the beginning, it
Yes,
is not
and
possible.
we haven't talked yet about the famous Ned Block's famous distinction between access consciousness and phenomenal consciousness. And
Yep.
he's, I don't know, 30 years ago now, kind of focused the philosophical and scientific debate about consciousness by saying, well, it's very easy, kind of easy problem to define various kinds of functional categories, in particular, which brain states can you subjectively ascertain that you have and report that you have them, and which brain states are in that sense introspectively accessible. And he said, well, that's one thing, but that's just a matter of uh, 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 causal organization in the brain. What we're really interested in is phenomenal consciousness, states that are like something, and that's not to be functionally defined. And then when he turns to, well, now he's going to explain what phenomenal consciousness is. He says, and I think I'm almost quoting, he says, I cannot define it in any remotely non-circular way. It's states that are like something. And all one can do is point to the states that, in our case, we are directly aware of as conscious. And if you think about it, that's such a loose notion. In effect, what we're doing is we're taking a bunch of states which we're introspectively aware of, pains and color experiences and so on, and saying, well, consciousness is what's common to those states. And in other organisms, the state will be conscious if it's like those states, if it's like these states. We're doing a kind of ostensive definition. And the trouble is that uh, those states share an awful lot of properties. They'll be in the global workspace, they'll involve corticothalamic loops, they'll involve interaction with reasoning, they'll involve interaction with associative learning, and so on. And then states like that. And then we go to other organisms that have some of those features and not others. And what's to decide whether their states are sufficiently like our states to be conscious? And I think this whole idea that there's a thing, phenomenal consciousness, that we need to study scientifically it evaporates into thin air. I mean, once you become a materialist, of course, if you're a dualist, then you think there's a real thing there. But uh, so you can see why I think a lot of the scientific business of trying to identify consciousness is mismotivated.
Yeah,
You
and
agree?
I like the internal coherence of what you're saying, because that is that is internally consistent, and those who try to explain consciousness
Mm.
have, whether they know it or not, an
Yeah.
identity theory approach, and it may be a very specific kind of thing that they're looking
Okay,
for, and
Robert,
you're saying that that's
you
not
say
possible. I
my
would.
my views are internally coherent, but you don't sound persuaded. Oh dear.
No, no, I'm not persuaded. Uh,
Uh,
but I do like the internal consistency, and I think
mm.
it and the reason I like it is because it reflects on what
Yeah,
a
yeah, yeah.
lot of other people are doing that they don't realize. Um, and that's what I like. Look, I like its internal consistency for its purity. That's for sure. But I also like its reflection and its view of what a lot of other people are working on. All of that work is great work. I mean, we all supported it. It's very
Yeah.
interesting, the different theories and how the brain works. I mean, we love it. But as an explanation of consciousness, you shine a very bright spotlight on what they're really doing. However, from as I would look at it, I would see a difference, and we're going to disagree on this, between the use of the word intelligence, which is an objective third person view of behaviors
Right.
of living entities or non-living entities. It can be AI, of course. With consciousness, which is by its very core nature a first-person subjective view, and I doubt we can make more
Yes, I mean,
progress
I'm
than just
not. I mean,
stating
of
that.
course, I don't want to deny that consciousness is a first-person phenomenon, and it's subjective. It's something going on in me, and it's subjective in the extra sense that I can know introspectively that it's going on in me. But nothing much follows from all that if you're a materialist. I mean, perhaps I should say that I don't. I mean, my views might strike some people as radical, but I don't think of them as any more radical than the basic materialism. I think that I'm just drawing out natural consequences of materialism, and I think the people who say
I
they're
agree with that.
materialists and want to resist the consequences I draw need to look into their hearts and ask themselves whether they really are where they're really true materialists.
Yeah, I think that's a terrific point. It's a bright spotlight that you shine on many of the theories, and that gets us into the so-called meta problem of consciousness, which is why is there a problem of consciousness that Dave Chalmers and many others have focused on, and you love that question because that allows you to
Sure.
really,
So I
shoot
was
the bullseye.
surprised to see Dave Chalmers after all these years turning to what has always struck me as the most immediate thing to ask in the area of consciousness, which is why do we find it so puzzling? Uh, what is it that makes us feel that there's something extra to explain here? And and my answer is, well, it's because we find it very difficult at an intuitive level to free ourselves of dualist thoughts. And of course, once you have these dualist thoughts, then you're going to be faced with a whole lot of explanatory problems. But to my mind, the right response isn't to try and try and answer these demands for explanation, but to say the demands for explanation are mismotivated. They're motivated precisely by the thought that there's something extra here over and above the physical processes. Uh, so we haven't really talked much about the assumption that drives a lot of my thinking about consciousness, which is that pretty much everybody, including committed materialists like me, find it very hard to avoid dualist thoughts. And why is that exactly? And that's one version of the meta problem of consciousness. I mean, if you're a materialist like me, the puzzle is why is materialism so hard to believe? Why is it that dualism seems so compelling? And over the years, I've offered lots of different suggestions about this. I now think, I mean, I used to like a theory about a certain particular confusion we get into when we think of what I say is one and the same brain state in two different ways. We think of it in terms of what it feels like. We think of it in terms of the brain processes involved. And when we think of it in terms of what it feels like, we actually tend to imagine the state. We give ourselves a faint version of the state, and then we notice that over here on this side we've got the feeling, and over here on this side we're just thinking of neurons, and we think this side leaves out the feeling. And I say that's a kind of natural line of thought, but in fact, if you think it through, it involves a certain kind of use mention confusion. The fact that you're not using the feelings over here doesn't mean you're not referring to them. And I used to like that explanation and resist other explanations, such as that it's just an upshot of the influence of monotheistic religions in our culture, or that it's very hard, given the way the brain's organized, for us to merge these two concepts, the subjective concept and the scientific concept. But I now think it's not a competition here. There might be lots of different pressures, all pushing in the same direction, inclining us towards dualist thoughts. And
Mm.
and my now views, let 100 explanations bloom. I mean, why not appeal to all the different pressures that make us think like dualists rather than materialists? So, but if that's the meta problem, what makes us inclined towards dualism? I'm all in favor of pursuing it.
No, that's completely consistent with your whole worldview. It's as if you planted that question to be asked, so that you could give a robust answer. So I like that as well. David, you make the claim that consciousness is not the key to moral standing, which to me is not intuitively obvious.
Maybe it's not intuitively obvious. I mean, in fact, I agree it's not intuitively obvious, but I think it follows from things we've been talking about already. So the issue arises most obviously in connection with animals. Which animals deserve moral consideration? It's a hot topic now. I mean, especially in Britain, we've got philosophers advising the government about whether it's all right to mistreat prawns, crabs, lobsters, octopuses, insects. Many people studying bees now think bees are very sophisticated, intelligent organisms. Should we think about causing them stress and pain? And for many people, the question is equivalent to the question of are octopuses conscious? I think it's pretty obvious octopuses are conscious. Are bees conscious? And if they're conscious, well, then we certainly should think about how we treat them. And if they're not conscious, it's all right. And I think that's the wrong way to address the question, for the reason that came up earlier. I don't think there's a definite answer to whether bees are conscious or not. It's like asking, are bees intelligent? Well, yes and no. And if you thought consciousness was an extra light over and above the physical goings on, well, then there'd be a fact of the matter about whether bees had it or not. But I don't think there is any extra light. I just think there's different kinds of physical processes. So I don't think the way to address this moral issue is to ask about whether they're conscious. It's not that I don't think there's a moral issue here. I think there's a big moral issue. And I think the moral issue is going to become very pressing very soon, in connection not with biological organisms, but with artificial intelligences, social companions, systems designed to be companions to people. Can the people mistreat those systems or not? Okay. Again, many people say, well, depends on whether the AI systems are conscious. I think that's the wrong question. I think we should just look and see, how smart are the bees? How distressed do they get? Don't think of it in terms of economy. How agitated in terms of their behavior do they get? Do they have projects? Can they learn from their mistakes? And once you know enough about that, then that ought to be enough to tell you whether you can treat bees badly.
And this is why the whole subject of consciousness today, that has been a philosophical question or a very highly specific neurobiological question, is now broken into the public square in terms of artificial intelligence in particular, but also the treatment of animals. So it's a very rich and complex question, and you really have provided some wonderful insights into a way of thinking about it. So what I want to do now to conclude is to have some fun, and this is not as serious as what we've been talking about. And so we're not going to grade you or anything on the answers. So they'll be real quick. I'm going to give you a whole bunch of very short statements about consciousness, and I want you for each one to give me a number from 1 to 10, where 1 equals there's not a chance what you just said is true, to 10, which is you are quite certain, maybe 100% certain, that it is true. You can add a little short phrase to explain it, but just the 1 to 10. So are you ready? Here we go.
Yeah.
Number 1, consciousness is entirely physical.
10.
Good. I would be shocked if you gave me any other answer. Eliminative materialism, so-called illusionism, is correct, where we can what we're doing is imagining consciousness as much more than it really is.
5.
Interesting.
5. I think that one really turns into a matter of definition. That's why I said 5.
Epiphenomenalism is correct, where consciousness seems to have causative powers. It is real in a kind of quasi-dualistic sense, but it has no causative power. It's like, the foam on the ocean waves.
0, am I allowed 0 or 1? Anyway, right at the bottom.
Next, neurobiology is obviously necessary for consciousness, but neurobiology is also sufficient for consciousness.
I disagree with I disagree with the presupposition. I don't think neurobiology is necessary for consciousness because of the artificial systems. But I do think it's sufficient. So 10 for sufficient.
Okay, good. The mind is computational.
7. I would have said yes, but Peter Godfrey Smith has been writing about this issue recently and has been saying a lot of interesting things about how the non-neuronal aspects of mental processing might matter for consciousness. And I'm kind of interested.
Functionalism is correct, that any substance that enables the appropriate functions, whether biological or non-biological, can be conscious.
7. Kind of the same issue, I think.
AI can be conscious. There are no in-principle barriers to AI consciousness.
9.
Information obviously is involved in consciousness, but information is in some sense actually the deep ontology of consciousness.
2. My last book is a strong argument against equating consciousness with representation.
Integrated information theory, which is a hot area and highly controversial, will help discern the fundamental nature of consciousness. The question doesn't say is IIT correct? I'm not asking you that. But will it help in any way to discern the fundamental theory of consciousness?
1.
Quantum. That's clear.
Yeah, the term pseudoscience went through my head, but I won't endorse that. I don't think that was the right thing to say.
Okay, good. I think we agree on both of those. Quantum physics plays a special role in consciousness. We now know that quantum physics plays a real role in biology and photosynthesis and various other kinds of mechanisms, but in consciousness it plays a special role.
Trying to say 1 or 2, but I don't think it plays any more special role for consciousness than it does for chemical reactions.
Okay, so in my terminology, that would be a clear 1.
Okay.
And again, quite consistent. This is another easy one. Substance dualism is correct. There's some kind of a soul or spirit. I don't even have to wait for your answer.
Minus 10.
Minus 1. Okay, off the scale. Property dualism is correct, that there is only one substance, but mental phenomena are not reducible.
1, bottom of the scale.
Okay, so substance dualism is a -1, property dualism is a 1, so you distinguish between the two, right?
Yeah, well, I mean, substance dualism is more dualism than property dualism. Yeah.
Okay, right, absolutely. Another easy one. Panpsychism is correct, that every particle or fundamental field of physics has a bit of consciousness or proto-consciousness.
2.
Okay, that's interesting. So panpsychism is a little bit higher than dualism.
Yeah.
Okay, all right.
I only said that because I've kind of said this sometimes. Other people said there's a sense in which a dyed-in-the-wool materialist like me has some similarities with panpsychism in that I don't think anything extra is needed beyond just basic material stuff to give you consciousness. So, but it needs to be in a special place, playing a special role.
Yeah, some would claim, Galen Strawson, that the real materialist is a panpsychist because
Yeah.
because panpsychism or proto consciousness or whatever is part of the physical world.
Yes, no, I'm not thinking like that. I don't think what panpsychists like Strawson and Goff say is that the structure of the physical world isn't enough to give you consciousness. I don't agree about that.
Yeah,
I think that the thing that they add to the structure of the physical world is a very weird and unmotivated bit of reality.
Idealism is correct that all reality is only consciousness.
One.
Near death or out of body experiences can provide special insight into consciousness.
3, 4.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Psi or parapsychology, telepathy, precognition, clairvoyance, psychokinesis. These can also supply special insight into consciousness.
2. The thing about near-death experiences, out-of-body experiences, is that there's very interesting neuroscience about how they work, and they can, in that way, give us some insight into what's going on when we're consciously aware of things.
That's a good, important qualification, and I agree with that.
Yeah.
For what little that matters. Radical identity theory, your theory, mind states are brain states. 10 plus.
10, yeah, absolutely.
Only the physical exists as fundamental reality of deep. Only the physical exists as fundamental ontology of deepest reality.
7.
Wow.
I'm just thinking about numbers, abstract objects like that. I mean, if I said, look, I'm a physicalist, I think there's nothing in concrete reality that's not physical, then it would be 10. But there's a realm of abstract objects. I mean, I'm inclined to deny it, but there the arguments are much more fuzzy, and I don't have kind of
very good, very important distinction between concrete and abstract objects. You're a 10 on concrete and a 7 because you factor in abstract. Very important point, David. This is really terrific. If I were going to be a materialist and physicalist, I'd be your kind, for sure.
That's very kind of you to say so. Thank you.
I said if. Remember, I said if. If I'm going to do that,
I'm going to be your kind.
Viewers who like Closer to Truth can make a tax-deductible donation to Closer to Truth by clicking on the donation button. Donations directly support the creation of videos like this one and ensure we can keep Closer to Truth free from paywalls. Viewers can watch for free hundreds of TV episodes and over 1,500 exclusive videos on consciousness, brain, and mind on the Closer to Truth website or YouTube channel. For my comprehensive review of theories of consciousness, search Landscape of Consciousness on Closer to Truth. Thanks for watching. David, it's been a great pleasure.
It's been great talking to you. Thank you.
Thank you for watching. If you like this video, please like and comment below. You can support Closer to Truth by subscribing.